In the heart of Santiago, where the city pulses with life and laughter spills from crowded cafes, there was a young man whose smile could light up even the darkest corners. His name was Daniel Zamudio. To those who knew him, he was more than just a face in the crowd. He was a beacon of joy, a testament to living authentically in a world that often demanded conformity. Daniel was the kind of person who carried his heart on his sleeve. At just 24 years old, he embraced life with an openness that was as refreshing as it was rare. He didn't shy away from being himself, even when it meant standing out in ways that others might not understand. To some, his confidence was inspiring. To others, it was infuriating. In a world where acceptance was still a fragile concept, Daniel's unwavering pride in his identity was both his strength and, as fate would have it, his vulnerability. What began as an ordinary evening in the vibrant streets of Santiago would soon unravel into a night that would shock a nation and change the course of history. This is the story of Daniel Zamudio, a young man who became an unwilling symbol of a battle far greater than himself. It was a cool March evening in 2012, the kind of night where the streets of Santiago were alive with energy. The city's parks were often a refuge, quiet pockets where people could gather their thoughts, meet friends, or simply breathe in the stillness away from the rush of the world. San Borja Park was one of those places. Daniel Zamudio walked into the park that night, likely unaware that his path would soon cross with a group of men who had no regard for his life. These weren't random strangers, nor was their presence in the park coincidental. They had a shared ideology, an ideology steeped in hate, intolerance, and violence. And in Daniel, they saw something they wanted to destroy. The attack began with words, cruel, mocking slurs meant to dehumanize. But it didn't stop there. The verbal assault quickly escalated into physical violence, and what followed was a level of brutality so unimaginable that it would send shockwaves across Chile. Over the next 6 hours, Daniel endured a sustained, calculated attack. They struck him repeatedly, kicking and punching with unrelenting force. But the beating was only the beginning. They took their time, as if each act of violence needed to leave a lasting mark. They carved swastikas into his skin, symbols of hate that forever scarred his body. They burned him with cigarettes, each deliberate press of ember against flesh a horrifying reminder of their disdain for who he was. But they weren't done. In their rage, they broke his leg, leaving him unable to move. And then they left him there, battered, bloodied, and broken in the middle of the park, as if his life was worth nothing. By the time someone found Daniel, it was clear this wasn't just an attack. It was an execution in slow motion, fueled by prejudice and hatred. The injuries were so severe that even seasoned medical professionals were horrified. The question wasn't whether Daniel would recover, it was whether he would survive the night. For Daniel Zamudio, the park that had once offered peace became the scene of a horrific crime. For Chile, it became a place forever etched in memory, the site of an atrocity that would force the nation to confront its darkest truths. When Daniel Zamudio was discovered in San Borja Park, it was almost too late. Barely clinging to life, his body bore the marks of an unspeakable crime, a broken leg, cigarette burns, carved symbols of hate. Paramedics rushed him to the Posta Central Hospital in Santiago, where a team of doctors fought desperately to undo the damage inflicted during those 6 horrifying hours. Word of the attack spread quickly, first among Daniel's friends and family, and then across the city. As Daniel lay unconscious in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines that kept his battered body alive, his family refused to leave his side. His mother, Jacqueline Vera, held vigil day and night, her grief etched into every word as she pleaded for her son to survive. But Daniel's fight for life was excruciatingly slow. For 25 days, doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize him, while the nation began to grapple with the implications of the crime. Protests erupted in the streets of Santiago and beyond. Crowds gathered outside the hospital, holding vigils and demanding justice, as Chilean citizens tried to make sense of the hate that had stolen the peace of their capital. During those weeks, Daniel became more than a man, he became a symbol. His story brought visibility to a truth that many had ignored for too long, that LGBTQ+ individuals in Chile lived under the constant shadow of fear and prejudice. But on March 27, 2012, the machines fell silent. Daniel's injuries were too severe, his body too broken to recover. His death shattered the hopes of his family and sent ripples of anguish throughout the country. The news of Daniel's passing wasn't just a moment of mourning, it was a reckoning. His death forced Chile to confront a grim reality. It was no longer possible to turn away from the violence, the hate, and the systemic neglect that allowed such a crime to occur. Daniel's story was no longer just about one young man, it had become a national awakening. And so, as his family prepared to lay him to rest, a nation stood behind them, united in grief but also in anger. The calls for justice grew louder. The world was watching, and Chile could no longer afford to remain silent. When the news of Daniel Zamudio's death broke, it was as if a dam had burst. What began as whispers of a horrific attack grew into a tidal wave of grief, anger, and collective outrage that swept across Chile. For a nation long accustomed to looking the other way, the brutality of what Daniel had endured made it impossible to ignore the reality of homophobia any longer. In the days that followed, thousands took to the streets. The protests were both a mourning for Daniel and a demand for change. People carried candles, flowers, and posters with his face, chanting his name as they marched through Santiago's streets. Vigils were held outside the hospital where Daniel had fought for his life, and later outside government buildings, where activists demanded answers, and action. But it wasn't just LGBTQ+ communities that rallied for Daniel. His story resonated with parents, students, and everyday citizens, many of whom had never considered the extent of discrimination in their country. The sheer savagery of the attack had struck a nerve. It became a national conversation, no longer confined to private whispers or marginalized voices. Media coverage intensified as journalists uncovered more details of the crime, exposing the hatred that fueled it and the systemic failures that allowed it to happen. Television networks aired debates, editorials filled newspapers, and social media platforms were flooded with tributes to Daniel and calls for justice. The outrage wasn't limited to Chile. International human rights organizations condemned the attack, shining a global spotlight on the country and amplifying the demands for reform. For Daniel's family, the outpouring of support was both comforting and overwhelming. His mother, Jacqueline Vera, became a central figure in the movement, speaking publicly about her son's life and the love he carried for those around him. Her heartbreak turned into a rallying cry as she vowed to ensure her son's death would not be in vain. As the protests swelled, it became clear that this wasn't just about Daniel Zamudio. His story had become a symbol for every life touched by hatred and prejudice. It was about the countless LGBTQ+ individuals who lived in fear, the victims of violence whose names were forgotten, and the fight for a future where no one would have to face such brutality. The streets of Santiago were filled with tears and anger, but they were also filled with resolve. Daniel's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a turning point. The people of Chile were demanding more than justice for him, they were demanding a reckoning with the prejudice that had taken his life. The country was at a crossroads, and there was no turning back. For years, the conversation around discrimination in Chile had been met with hesitation, delays, and political stalemates. Bills were introduced, debates were held, but little ever came of them. Protections for marginalized groups remained out of reach, lost in the tangle of bureaucracy and a society reluctant to face its ingrained biases. But Daniel Zamudio's death forced a reckoning. The image of a young man whose only crime had been living openly as himself shook the nation to its core. Protests filled the streets, vigils lit up the nights, and public pressure mounted like never before. The demand was simple yet urgent. No one else should suffer what Daniel had endured. In the wake of this tragedy, lawmakers could no longer remain on the sidelines. The conversations that had once stalled were now infused with a new urgency. Politicians from across the spectrum felt the weight of public outrage, and the calls for change became impossible to ignore. By July 2012, just months after Daniel's death, the anti-discrimination law was passed. Known informally as the Zamudio law, it represented a monumental shift in Chilean legislation. For the first time, it became illegal to discriminate based on sexual orientation, gender identity, race, religion, or any other characteristic that made someone vulnerable to hate. The law included mechanisms to file complaints and penalties for those found guilty of discriminatory acts. It was designed not only to punish but also to send a clear message: hate would no longer be tolerated in Chile. For Daniel's family, the passage of the law was bittersweet. His mother, Jacqueline Vera, spoke openly about her hope that this new legal framework would spare other families the heartbreak she had endured. "I wish my son didn't have to die for this to happen," she said in an emotional statement. "But if his death can save even one life, then he didn't die in vain." The Zamudio law was a victory, but it was also a reminder of the cost of inaction. For years, the voices calling for equality had gone unheard, and Daniel's death became a painful symbol of what happens when a society fails to protect its most vulnerable. Even with the law in place, activists warned that the fight was far from over. Legislation could lay the foundation, but changing hearts and minds would take much longer. Daniel's story had lit a fire under a movement that had waited too long in the shadows, and the fight for true equality continued. Still, the passage of the Zamudio law stood as a testament to the power of collective action, the resilience of those who demanded change, and the legacy of a young man who, in death, helped pave the way for a more just society. Justice is a word that carries weight, especially in cases as harrowing as Daniel Zamudio's. But for his family, friends, and the countless people who had rallied for him, justice wouldn't come easy. The trial of the 4 men responsible for his brutal death would drag on for over a year, every detail of the case revisited in agonizing detail. In October 2013, after months of testimonies, forensic evidence, and courtroom deliberations, the verdict was finally delivered. The 4 men, Patricio Ahumada Garay, Alejandro Angulo Tapia, Raul Lopez Fuentes, and Fabian Mora Mora, were convicted of first-degree murder. Their crime wasn't just an act of violence, it was a hate-fueled attack designed to strip Daniel of his humanity. The court identified Patricio Ahumada Garay as the ringleader, a man whose neo-Nazi ideology and unrelenting hatred had driven the group's actions that night. His role in orchestrating the 6-hour torture of Daniel earned him the harshest punishment, a life sentence. Ahumada showed little remorse during the trial, a chilling reminder of the depth of the hate that fueled his actions. His accomplices, Alejandro Angulo Tapia and Raul Lopez Fuentes, were each sentenced to 15 years in prison. Their roles, though not as dominant as Ahumada's, were no less horrifying. They had participated in every act of cruelty, every decision to prolong Daniel's suffering. The youngest of the group, Fabian Mora Mora, received a 7-year sentence. His defense argued his limited involvement, painting him as someone who had followed the others rather than led. But the court found no excuse for his participation in the crime, emphasizing that every member of the group had played a role in Daniel's death. For Daniel's family, the sentencing brought some measure of closure but not peace. His mother, Jacqueline Vera, sat in the courtroom as the sentences were read, her face a mixture of relief and sorrow. "This is justice," she said later, her voice heavy with emotion. "But it won't bring my son back." The trial had captivated the nation, with every detail of the attack and its aftermath laid bare. It wasn't just about punishing the guilty, it was about exposing the deep-seated prejudices that had led to such a horrific crime. The courtroom became a mirror for Chilean society, reflecting the lingering undercurrents of hate and intolerance that had allowed such an act to occur. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered as the verdicts were announced. Some cheered, seeing the sentences as a step forward in the fight against hate crimes. Others held candles and photos of Daniel, quietly mourning the young man whose life had been stolen. The sentencing marked the end of the legal battle, but it was far from the end of Daniel's story. His name had become a symbol, his death a rallying cry. And while his killers would spend years behind bars, the fight for equality and acceptance continued in his memory. Justice had been served, but the deeper question lingered: how do you heal a society scarred by hatred? For Chile, the answer lay not just in punishment but in transformation, one that Daniel's legacy had already begun to inspire. Daniel Zamudio's story didn't fade with the courtroom verdicts. It grew louder, transcending the headlines to become a cultural and societal touchstone. In the years following his death, Daniel's name was immortalized in ways that ensured his legacy would endure, not just as a victim, but as a catalyst for change. In 2015, Chilean television aired Zamudio, Lost at Night, a haunting miniseries that retraced the events leading up to Daniel's death. The series was unflinching, showing not just the brutality of the crime but also the societal prejudices that allowed such hatred to fester. Viewers watched in horror as the dramatized retelling brought Daniel's story to life, reminding the nation of the price of indifference. Artists, too, found inspiration in Daniel's legacy. Murals appeared across Santiago, vibrant and defiant, depicting him as a symbol of strength in the face of hate. Poets and musicians penned works dedicated to him, their words and melodies carrying his memory far beyond the borders of Chile. Daniel's impact wasn't confined to creative spaces. His death became a rallying cry for activists fighting for LGBTQ+ rights. Pride marches in Santiago and other cities often began with moments of silence in his honor, his face emblazoned on banners carried by thousands. For many, Daniel was no longer just a victim, he was a martyr in the ongoing battle for equality. His name also became synonymous with legal progress. The Zamudio law, passed months after his death, was frequently referenced in public discourse as a landmark moment in Chile's history, a reminder of what could be achieved, but also a call to continue the work. Internationally, Daniel's story resonated. Advocacy groups and human rights organizations held events in his honor, using his case as an example of the urgent need to combat hate crimes worldwide. His face became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that every act of violence born of intolerance demands accountability and change. And yet, for all the progress made in Daniel's name, his story remained a painful reminder of how far there was still to go. While his legacy inspired hope and action, it also underscored the fragility of those gains in the face of enduring prejudice. Daniel Zamudio didn't set out to become a symbol. He was simply a young man living his truth. But in death, he became something larger, a voice for those silenced by hate, a reminder of the cost of inaction, and an enduring light in the fight for justice and equality. Daniel Zamudio's life, marked by laughter and the simple joys of being himself, was abruptly and violently extinguished. His death was a painful reminder of the lengths to which hatred could go, but it was also the spark that ignited change in a nation long reluctant to confront its prejudices. Through the immense grief his family and friends endured, Daniel's name became synonymous with resilience, and his story became an emblem of the ongoing fight for human dignity and equality. Though he never sought the mantle of martyr, Daniel's death became a turning point, a moment in history when Chile, and much of the world, could no longer look the other way. His legacy lives on in the laws that were passed in his honor, in the murals that commemorate his life, and in the countless activists and ordinary citizens who carry his story forward. His story is far from finished. Every year, as marches take place and voices rise in solidarity, Daniel's memory is both celebrated and solemnly observed. His life serves as a poignant reminder that the battle for justice, for acceptance, and for the right to live freely is ongoing. The fight to end hate and violence, the fight to ensure every person is treated with dignity, continues. Daniel Zamudio may no longer walk among us, but his spirit endures, a symbol of the power of resilience in the face of unimaginable adversity. His story reminds us all, the price of hatred is too high, and the cost of silence even higher. If you want to learn more about cases that shape history and uncover the stories that challenge us, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Stay informed, stay aware, and join the conversation. The fight for justice continues, and so does the pursuit of truth.